Epilogue. Darcy stepped down from the carriage and extended his hand to help his wife alight before tending to his son. "No, no, I will take him," Richard said, as he tossed the reins of his horse to a groom and hurried toward the Darcy's carriage to scoop up his namesake before the child's father could claim him. 2-year-old Alexander Darcy, Alexander was Richard's middle name, squealed with delight as his uncle swept him into the air and placed him on his shoulder. "Return him in an hour," said Elizabeth. "He will be tired and hungry, and not at all pleasant if you keep him out longer than that." "Ah, but we will not be hungry. Will we, Alex? Uncle Richard will find you a biscuit." "An hour," Elizabeth's tone was firm. Richard was an excellent uncle when he was not being indulgent. She leaned on Darcy's arm and whispered, "How do you suppose he will react when we tell him that he is to be an uncle a second time?" She placed her hand on her abdomen that was only now beginning to feel full and slightly rounded. Darcy chuckled, delighted. He has claimed that he wishes to see every room in Pemberley filled. It was true. Richard had taken to the idea of being an uncle quickly, and with the same fervour with which he approached most tasks. He promised that he would teach the child to ride and shoot, and he would see him well educated at Darcy's expense. Then he had best find himself a wife and get on with the filling of the rooms. "He's not getting any younger," Elizabeth said with a laugh. "We will not be filling them all?" Darcy waggled his brows and smiled at his wife. "No, we will not. We must save some room for my father, mother and sisters when they visit." And visit they would, often as they already had. Darcy was becoming accustomed to the commotion Elizabeth's mother created on each and every visit, and he welcomed the times he could spend tucked away in the library with her father, for he had come to realise that though the man lacked exertion, he did not lack intellect. They had spent many a pleasurable hour in discussions of various books, or locked in a strategic battle on a chessboard. Georgiana had been delighted to have ladies of about her age, with whom to discuss all the topics that young ladies discuss, behind bedroom doors, while wearing robes and slippers, and sipping tea as a candle burned low and hissed. Elizabeth had been terrified to allow her sisters to spend unsupervised time with Georgiana. Georgiana was all that was proper. She was young, but she was calm and reserved, where Elizabeth's younger sisters were excitable and outgoing. However, Elizabeth had not taken into account the effect that £30,000 and aunts, who were ladies of the first circles with connections to titles, could have on impressionable young ladies who wished to snare eligible husbands and improve their lots in life. Apparently, with the correct incentive, even Lydia could be found learning to play the piano, while Kitty sang and Mary painted. It was remarkable, really, how the quality of the society in which her sisters now found themselves had elevated their own expectations of their behaviour. Darcy waited as Elizabeth removed her hat and pelisse. "Are you ready?" There was always an interview of sorts to endure whenever the Darcys arrived at Rosings. Lady Catherine would wish to know about their trip, as well as any news about Georgiana and the Bennet girls. Just as she did when she travelled to Pemberley or visited with Darcy in London, Lady Catherine would also demand that Alexander stand before her for inspection, upon the completion of which there was always some small treat to be had. However, today, that inspection would have to wait, until Uncle Richard had had his playtime. "I am," Elizabeth replied. "We should not keep her waiting." When it came to Darcy's family, Elizabeth had found her footing quickly. Richard was a teasing elder brother, Georgiana was a loving sister, Lord and Lady Matlock were welcoming, as was their son, the Viscount, and his wife. And then there were Lady Catherine and Anne. Anne was a faithful correspondent informing Elizabeth of all that was newsworthy in Kent. Anne's mother was a doting great-aunt, and regarded Elizabeth more as a daughter than a niece. She had even taken it upon herself to introduce Elizabeth and Jane to London society. That was the only place where Elizabeth's transition into her new life had been truly daunting. Lady Catherine had not been in society for many years, and so her connections were not what they once were. There were frequent arguments between Lady Catherine and her brother, Lord Matlock, about what engagements were truly important for the new Mrs. Darcy and Mrs. Bingley to attend. Whether it was because Lord Matlock knew more about society than Lady Catherine, or just more about Darcy's aversion to society, Elizabeth did not care. for his interference had kept her home and afforded her time for solitude and reading. "Did Charles not join you?" Lady Catherine asked, after greeting both Darcy and Elizabeth with a kiss on the cheek. Charles Bingley had found himself taken in as a member of the family by Lady Catherine. If there was one thing that Darcy's aunt found tantalising, it was the prospect of offering guidance, by way of instruction and reprimand, to those whom she deemed in need of such service. Bingley, being both from trade and an orphan, was, in Lady Catherine's opinion, decidedly in need of her assistance. Thankfully, Bingley was an amiable man, and his wife was long-suffering, for Lady Catherine was not always tactful in her instruction. Unfortunately, or perhaps happily for some, Caroline Ainsworth née Bingley was not as amiable as her brother, and soon decided it was best not to be found very often in Lady Catherine's presence. Therefore, she determined to keep herself to her husband's sphere of friends as much as possible. "We left earlier, so that we could call on the parsonage before arriving at Rosings," Darcy explained, as he led Elizabeth to a sofa. "Another?" Darcy looked at his aunt in confusion. "Pardon me? Another what?" "Child." She waved her hand at Elizabeth. "Your wife is walking as if she's with child. You cannot keep avoiding society in such a fashion, Darcy." Her tone was stern, but she smiled. "I do hope it is a girl this time," she said as she took her seat. "My given name is Catherine Estella, you know." This was not new information to either Elizabeth or Darcy. Lady Catherine had contributed a great list of acceptable names during Elizabeth's first pregnancy. "Estella is beautiful," said Elizabeth. "Indeed," said Lady Catherine, settling back in her chair and looking satisfied that her name would one day be borne by a Darcy child. "The child is expected to arrive before the season, and we intend to be in town with Georgiana and Elizabeth's sisters during the season," said Darcy. Lady Catherine clucked her tongue, still unmarried and so pretty. She was nearly as bad as Mrs. Bennet in wishing to see all the Bennet daughters well married. "We shall have to see what can be done on that front." "But what of Anne?" asked Darcy. "Will she not need you here?" "She has her husband and Mrs. Jenkinson, and I will not be far if I am needed." Anne had married in the spring following Darcy and Elizabeth's fateful trip to Rosings. Mr. Abney had indeed been interested in courting Anne, and once Darcy had stepped away, Mr. Abney had taken very little time in making his intentions known. They, their daughter, and Mrs. Jenkinson, who had been retained to help care for the child, lived at an estate 10 miles from Rosings and nearer to London. "But will you not miss your grandchild too much?" Darcy teased. "I should say not. I shall visit Anne on my trip to town and again when I return, and while I am in town I shall have others to snuggle." She smiled at the thought. "I have had cook make biscuits just for Alexander, his own tin." "He and Uncle Richard will be pleased," said Elizabeth with a laugh. Lady Catherine tipped her head and nodded slowly. "He's very good with children, is he not?" "Surprisingly so," said Darcy. "He was never so kind to me when we were children. However, he has always been understanding and gentle with Georgiana, so I suppose that it should not surprise me as it does." "He's selling his commission," Lady Catherine said as she straightened the hem of her sleeve. "Does he know this?" Darcy asked. Lady Catherine shrugged. "He has been considering the idea, but I may have helped it along." Darcy shook his head and chuckled. His aunt had always been meddlesome, but in the last 3 years she had become even more so. She straightened the hem of her other sleeve, a sure sign that she was up to something devious. "It is time he marry." She looked up with a knowing and somewhat calculating grin. "And I believe that I have found just the lady." This has been Discovering Mr. Darcy, a Dash of Darcy and Companions collection, Book 4. Written by Leanie Brown and narrated by Christopher, an authorised voice replica. The 2017 copyright for Discovering Mr. Darcy is held by Leanie Brown, all rights reserved.